Hello students, myself Iqbal Singh. I'm faculty for Political Science and International Relations optional paper at Vajiram and Ravi. Students, in this particular brief video, I'm going to have a discussion with you on the topic of evolution of Indian foreign policy. We are going to discuss that how Indian foreign policy has transitioned from the policy of non-alignment to the present day policy of multi-alignment. In fact, students, I must tell you that international politics is a very dynamic discipline. It is always undergoing a change. In fact, the world order is always evolving. For example, there used to be a time when the world was described as bipolar, and then it transitioned into unipolar, and now it has been transitioning into a multipolar world. That is the reason why foreign policies of states also change over the years, because states also have to find new ways to adapt to the changing world order. And that is exactly what has happened in the case of India. Indian foreign policy over the years have undergone massive changes. Many changes, several changes have happened in Indian foreign policy. In fact, it would not be possible for me to discuss all the changes in this particular discussion with you. But I have picked up one theme, and that is how our policy over the years have changed from non-alignment to the policy of multi-alignment. And what were the reasons for this change? And why did we make this change? What prompted India to make this change? And also what problems India has been facing while doing this transition? All this we are going to discuss in this video. And I must also tell you that this is one of the favorite topics of UPSC. In fact, UPSC has been asking multiple questions in the PSIR paper on this particular theme. So we must have a detailed discussion on this and try and develop a in-depth theoretical and conceptual understanding on this particular topic. So let's start our discussion, students. First of all, students, I will briefly help you understand how we adopted the policy of non-alignment, what was the policy of non-alignment, and why we adopted this particular policy. I'm sure you are all very well aware that the policy of non-alignment which India adopted in the initial years after independence is associated with the Nehruvian era. In fact, it is one of the hallmarks of the Nehruvian foreign policy. And this policy had evolved in the context of Cold War rivalry. As you must be aware, in the previous century, there was this intense rivalry between these two superpowers, which were capitalist US versus the communist Soviet Union. And this intense rivalry was described as the period of Cold War, which had lasted from 1945 to the year 1991. Now, during this Cold War period, the entire world was predominantly divided into two superpower blocks. One superpower bloc led by USA and the other superpower bloc led by communist Soviet Union. In this context, India decided to adopt the policy of non-alignment. Now, what do we mean by non-alignment? When India got its independence and we emerged as a republic in 1950, India at that time was a very young nation. We were a post-colonial state. We had come out of years of colonial exploitation. So India at that time had meager resources, scarce resources. And India made a conscious decision that we are not going to waste our resources in this rivalry of the superpowers. We will stay away from the rivalry of the superpowers and we will concentrate on our own growth and development. Therefore, India decided not to join any of these two superpower blocks, not to align with any of these two superpower blocks, and therefore remain non-aligned. So this policy India had adopted. And also, students, one more reason. Once you become a camp follower, once you join one of the superpower blocks, then you also in a way compromise your sovereignty. You in a way compromise the ability to have an independent foreign policy, because then you are expected to do bandwagoning of that particular superpower. Now that is also something which India wasn't ready to do, because India had just come out of colonial exploitation. India wanted to strengthen its sovereignty. India wanted to have an independent foreign policy. That is also India decided that we will stay away from this Cold War rivalry. We are not going to join any of these two camps, neither the American camp nor the Soviet camp, and therefore have our own independent foreign policy and exercise strategic autonomy. So the policy of non-alignment also helped India to develop strategic autonomy. And now a lot of you must not be aware what is strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy, students, is the ability to have an independent, autonomous foreign policy without any external interference, constraint, or pressure. And this has been one of the most important goals of Indian foreign policy, to exercise strategic autonomy. And non-alignment policy also enabled India to exercise strategic autonomy. I would also like to clarify, a lot of students, they tend to oversimplify non-alignment. They say non-alignment was just a policy of neutrality or policy of isolationism. India chose to remain neutral in the rivalry of the superpowers. No, students, it was not just about neutrality. It was more of maintaining a principled distance from the superpowers. India decided that we will have our own independent foreign policy, and our policy is based on our own principles. We should not be compelled or forced by these superpowers to adopt any particular policy or join any particular alliance. So India decided to maintain a principled distance from these superpowers and do issue-based alignment, because there used to be important world issues where India had taken its own independent stand, irrespective of whatever interest these superpowers had. So it is not just a policy of isolationism or neutrality. It is more of a policy of maintaining principled distance from the superpowers and also doing issue-based alignment. And this policy, which was followed during the tenure of Nehru, our first prime minister, also enabled India to exercise strategic autonomy. So that is how this policy of non-alignment had emerged in the context of the Cold War rivalry, in the context of the superpower rivalry. I must also tell you that this policy did, spread to other countries also. Many other countries also decided to follow same policy. Basically, all the post-colonial states, the poor and the developing countries of the world, they decided to follow a similar policy which India had advocated, which our Prime Minister had advocated. Therefore, the policy of non-alignment also had helped in developing this non-aligned movement. The NAM movement, you must be very well aware of this movement. So this movement was also, extension of the policy of non-alignment which India followed, which also prompted other nations to follow similar policy. Other post-colonial states and other developing countries of the world also decided to follow a similar policy during the Cold War period, which led to the emergence of the non-aligned movement also, which emerged as a result of the Bandung Conference, which had happened in 1955, and later the movement was officially launched in 1961 because of the Belgrade Summit. In fact, there were other prominent leaders of the world also who had contributed towards the emergence of NAM movement along with Nehru. For example, Tito of Yugoslavia. Then we also had Nasser of Egypt. We also had Kwame Nkrumah, also had Sukarno from Indonesia. So these are all considered as, these all prominent leaders of the world. They were all leaders of the post-colonial states. They are considered as the founding fathers of the policy of non-alignment and the NAM movement. So that is how this policy India followed in these initial years. And that is the reason why, students, this policy helped India to become the leader of the third world. Because these non-aligned countries, which were part of the NAM movement, they were described as the third world. The world basically was described into three worlds during Cold War period. First world was the rich, industrialized, capitalist world, which was in the US camp. And the second world was the communist world, which was in the Soviet camp. And the third world was the NAM movement, the non-aligned world, the non-aligned countries. So this movement or this policy of non-alignment in the initial years also helped India play a leadership role among the third world countries. It helped India to emerge as the leader of the third world and carve out a separate niche for itself in world politics. So that is how this policy of non-alignment had evolved during the Cold War period, during the Cold War rivalry. A lot of you must be wondering that if during the Cold War there were these three worlds, first, second, and the third world, then why do we describe the period as bipolar? Why world order at that time was described as bipolar? Because there were only two poles of power. One is the first world and the second world. First world led by US, second world led by Soviet Union. The third world, which was the non-aligned world, this was powerless. This was a pole, but it was powerless. It had no power. All these countries were post-colonial states, poor countries, developing countries, and international politics is all about struggle for power. Because the third world was powerless, therefore its role was marginalized, and that is the reason why the world order during Cold War was described as bipolar in nature, because of the two powerful poles existing, the US bloc and the Soviet bloc. So this is the policy which we had followed initially in our initial years in decade of 50s and 60s, and India was one of the prominent participants of the NAM summits which were regularly held, the first Bandung conference, later Belgrade summit, and also subsequent summits. And students, in the subject of international politics, there are many scholars who have done in-depth research on India's policy of non-alignment. And scholars are divided. There are scholarly views. There are scholars who have written on this and have appreciated India's policy of non-alignment. They are of the view that this was the right policy which India followed. It benefited India's national interest. But then at the same time, there are also prominent critiques of India's policy of non-alignment. And now we must discuss these viewpoints. Because in the PSIR paper, in order to academically enrich our answer, we are expected to make use of scholarly views and also IR theories and concepts. And that is also what we are going to do right now. Let's discuss various scholarly views, different scholarly views on India's initial policy of non-alignment. So first of all, students will discuss the views of those scholars who have been very appreciative of India's policy of non-alignment. They have tried to analyze the impact of non-alignment policy on India's national interest, and they have appreciated the policy. They've been of the opinion that this policy benefited India. And this was the best possible course of action India could have adopted at that particular time. One of them is Aparna Pandey. Aparna Pandey, students, wrote a book on evolution of Indian foreign policy. The title of the book is Chanakya to Modi. And in this recent writing, she has highlighted that how this policy was beneficial for India, policy of non-alignment. With the help of this policy, a materially and economically weak India, a militarily and economically weak India, was able to carve out a special niche for itself in world politics. In fact, India was able to emerge as the leader of the third world. So that India was able to do because of this particular policy. And also because of this policy, India was able to get best of both the worlds. Both the worlds, the US bloc and also the Soviet bloc. Like I told you, students, in the 50s, when we had just emerged out of colonization, India had meager resources. India had huge developmental challenges. So India definitely wanted foreign assistance, foreign aid. And India decided to remain non-aligned and therefore get this assistance from both the worlds. The US bloc also, the capitalist bloc, and also the communist bloc. So, for example, Americans did help India in terms of food security. They helped India in helping, they did provide India high-yielding varieties of seeds, which enabled us to do the Green Revolution. And also, during the 1962 war with China also, we were able to sought assistance from the Americans. And at the same time, we also got great amount of help from Soviet Union. Soviet Union also invested in India, especially in the steel plants, also emerged as major defense supplier of India. And India was able to secure a lot of support from Soviet Union in the 1971 war with Pakistan. So we were able to get best of both the worlds. So it was a very smart choice which India made at that particular time to follow the policy of non-alignment. This is the viewpoint of Aparna Pandey. Then I would, and also, we've already discussed that this policy was able to help India because India was able to exercise strategic autonomy. With the help of the non-alignment policy, India was able to exercise strategic autonomy. India was able to have an independent foreign policy without any external interference or external constraint or pressure. And we have multiple examples of that also. For example, India did adopt a principled stand with respect to the NPT treaty, the treaty which was related to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. India opposed that treaty. Also, in 1988, India did propose Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan on Disarmament to the United Nations. So we did take our own independent stance and, made our independent choices with respect to world issues during the Cold War period, because we were not compelled or forced by any of these superpowers to make foreign policy changes, because India was not part of any of these two alliances, any of these two blocks. India was non-aligned. So India was able to exercise considerable amount of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy. In fact, India played a prominent role in the working of United Nations also. India was one of the biggest troop contributing countries to UN peacekeeping operations as well. So that also is one reason why it benefited India. Then also, I would like to quote Michael Edwards also here. Who is Michael Edwards? He's a very renowned author. He wrote The Political Biography of Jawaharlal Nehru. And he's also appreciative of Nehru's policy of non-alignment. He says that India had no choice. India had no choice but to follow this policy. Why? He says India is a democratic country. India strongly supports liberal democratic values. Therefore, it was simply not possible for India to join the Soviet bloc. It wasn't possible for India to become a follower of the Soviet camp, because Soviet Union and all its friendly allies, they did not represent democracy. In fact, they used to reject these liberal values. These communist countries, most of them were dictatorships, communist dictatorships. So it wasn't possible for India to become part of this communist bloc, given the fact that India did respect and greatly value its liberal democratic values. And on the other hand, it was also not possible for India to join the American bloc. Why? Because of geopolitics, because India is geographically located in the close vicinity of Soviet Union. At that time, when Soviet Union did exist before 1991, if you look at the map, India was in the close proximity, close vicinity of Soviet Union. In fact, Soviet Union territories used to extend up till the border of Afghanistan. So it was not possible for India to join the American bloc, the Western bloc, because this might have jeopardized India's national security. So because of geopolitical compulsions and because of the compulsions of our respect for liberal democratic values, it wasn't possible for India to join any of these two blocks, any of these two superpower blocks, and therefore India chose to remain non-aligned. So Michael Edwards, in his biography of Nehru, says India had no other choice. And also he appreciates the policy. He says basically this non-aligned policy, he describes it as defense by friendship. He says that India was able to secure its defenses with the help of the non-aligned policy. That means India did not develop rivalry with any of these superpowers, stayed away from Cold War rivalry, and tried to maintain friendly relations with both these superpowers. And he describes this as defense by friendship. And Aparna Pandey also appreciates. She says India was able to get best of both the worlds and exercise strategic autonomy. I would also like to quote here, students, Professor T.V. Paul. Professor T.V. Paul is also very appreciative of the policy of non-alignment and also the NAM movement. In fact, he says that NAM movement has never got its due credit because it had considerable achievements for which it had achieved, but it has never been given that credit. And what are those achievements? He says that with the help of the policy of non-alignment and also the NAM movement, the weak states of the world, the weak countries, the poor countries, militarily weak countries, they were able to do soft balancing against the superpowers, against great powers. Because it wasn't possible for these weak countries to militarily counter these superpowers. So instead of doing hard balancing, they used to do soft balancing. He says that non-alignment policy played an important role in delegitimizing the threatening behavior of superpowers, which jeopardized world peace. In fact, he's also of the opinion that non-aligned countries played a very important role in strengthening the nuclear taboo. Nuclear taboo is an idea which has been given by the social constructivist scholar Nina Tannenwald, where she says that a nuclear taboo has emerged in the world. That means use of nuclear weapons, threat of nuclear weapons has been, delegitimized. That all over the world, the society has rejected the use of nuclear weapons being so destructive. And we have seen the destruction caused by these weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the world society, the world community has rejected the use of nuclear weapons. Use of nuclear weapons have been delegitimized by the society, which she describes as nuclear taboo. She says because a nuclear taboo had developed. That is the reason why the Americans were not able to use a nuclear weapon during the Vietnam War. Even though they lost the war, still they did not use the weapon because of the fear of nuclear taboo. And TV Paul says that non-aligned countries played an important role in strengthening this nuclear taboo by following the tools of naming and shaming. Naming and shaming these superpowers and criticizing their, threatening policies of using nuclear weapons and jeopardizing the world peace and bringing large-scale loss for the overall humanity on the planet. So there was a lot of criticism done, lot of naming and shaming done, which delegitimized the threatening behavior of the superpowers and even strengthened the nuclear taboo. In fact, TV Paul also is of the view that policy of non-alignment should also be given the credit for the fight against colonialism as well. So TV Paul is also very appreciative of this policy and has always appreciated the role of non-alignment. Then I would also like to quote Natwar Singh. Now, who is Natwar Singh? Natwar Singh is a former diplomat of India. He's a former IFS officer. In fact, after leaving IFS, he had also joined politics and he had also been the Minister of External Affairs of India. So he's the former Foreign Minister of India also. He wrote multiple books on Indian foreign policy and he has also appreciated the policy. He said that the non-alignment policy which India followed, it wasn't a dogma. In fact, he says it was a very flexible doctrine. It had a lot of flexibility which enabled India to make independent foreign policy choices, and instead of becoming a camp follower, India was able to make these independent foreign policy choices to best protect its own national interests. Like I told you, during the Chinese war, during the 62 war, India got some assistance from the Americans. But in the 71 war, India was able to secure support from Soviet Union because we had signed friendship treaty with USSR in 1971. So he says the policy was very flexible. It was a very flexible policy. It was a flexible doctrine. It wasn't a dogma. And this enabled India to have independent foreign policy instead of becoming a camp follower, instead of doing a bandwagoning of the superpowers. Because when you start doing bandwagoning, when you start blindly following the superpowers, when you become a camp follower, so you end up compromising your sovereignty. You end up compromising your strategic autonomy. And India avoided doing this. So Natwar Singh also appreciates the policy of non-alignment. But like I told you, students, there are many scholars who have criticized the policy of non-alignment. They are of the opinion that this policy wasn't beneficial for India. India suffered because of this policy choice which we made. That is the policy of non-alignment. So we must discuss the critiques of the non-aligned policy also. Let's have a discussion on the criticisms also. So students, let's now have a discussion on critiques of non-alignment. There have been various scholars, experts, and policy practitioners who have criticized India's policy of non-alignment. According to them, policy of non-alignment followed by Nehru represented Nehruvian idealism, and it compromised India's national security, India's national interests. They believe that the policy of non-alignment was a failure and it was an example of Nehruvian idealism, and idealism doesn't help you secure your interests in international politics. They are basically realist scholars. So students, now let's have a discussion on critiques of non-alignment. There have been experts, scholars, and policy practitioners who have given criticism of policy of non-alignment. They've written on this and they've said that India's policy of non-alignment failed India. It has considerable failures. It resulted in considerable failures, and it wasn't able to secure India's national interests and India's national security. So now we must have discussion on these criticisms also. The most prominent criticism recently has been done by Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar. I hope you know who's Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar. He is the former Foreign Secretary of India. He retired as the Foreign Secretary of India. I must tell you that Foreign Secretary is the highest ranking IFS officer in the country. Foreign Secretary is the bureaucrat in charge of the Ministry of External Affairs. And Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar had the distinction of being India's Foreign Secretary, one of the greatest diplomats we've ever produced. And after retiring from IFS, from the Foreign Service, he joined politics and right now is the cabinet minister. He is the Minister of External Affairs and is often described as one of the best foreign ministers in the world. He has written multiple books on Indian foreign policy. India's Way, Bharat Matters are few of his prominent writings. And he in his writings also have given a robust criticism of the Nehruvian idealism, robust criticism of a policy of non-alignment. He is of the opinion that the policy of non-alignment did represent Nehruvian idealism. It was an idealistic policy. It was too optimistic and therefore it compromised India's national interest and national security and failed India. He describes the policy of non-alignment as optimistic non-alignment. He says that India was too optimistic about this policy. India was too idealistic about this policy, and this backfired. He is of the opinion that while following the policy of non-alignment, India did make a false assumption. India falsely assumed because India is peace-loving, because India is not interested in Cold War rivalry, therefore other countries of the world would also behave peacefully with India. That false assumption India made, and Nehru made that false assumption. Nehru was too idealistic and too optimistic about the policy of non-alignment. And in the process, India did ignore its national security. India took its national security for granted. In fact, one of the prominent critiques of Nehru's idealism was Sardar Patel. Sardar Patel was very realistic in his foreign policy outlook. Students, you will have to make use of IR theories, realism, idealism in your PSIR answers to academically enrich your answers. So Sardar Patel was very realistic in his foreign policy outlook. In fact, Sardar Patel used to write letters to Nehru that international politics is all about struggle for power and we should focus on our national security. We must not ignore our national security. In fact, Sardar Patel, majorly disagreed with Nehru's China policy. Nehru, as you must be very well aware, had signed a friendship treaty with China called the Panchsheel Treaty. At that time, slogans like Hindi Chini, Bhai Bhai were quite popular. But Patel at that time, as long as he was there, he criticized Nehru's China policy. He said that China is a threat. China is a potential threat and we must prepare for this threat. But Nehruvian idealism and the policy of non-alignment was too optimistic, too idealistic, and we never took this threat very seriously. And this criticism which Sardar Patel had made, unfortunately, this actually proved true. Because in 1962, China attacked India. And when you read history, you read India was surprised, India wasn't prepared for this war, and therefore India lost the war, and China occupied our territories, which till date are under China's control, the territory of Aksai Chin. But the million-dollar question here, which Dr. Jaishankar would ask is, why were you surprised? Why were you not prepared for a war with China? Because you were too optimistic, you were too idealistic. Therefore, this Nehruvian idealism failed India. Non-alignment policy was not able to secure India's national security. And that's exactly what has happened. In fact, during the tenure of Nehru, we lost territory to Pakistan also in 1947, and we lost territory to China also in 1962. That means we were not able to secure our territorial integrity. We were not able to secure our national security, and the policy of non-alignment did not help. It did not help. So that is the reason why Dr. Jaishankar in his writings, he describes Nehru's policy of non-alignment as optimistic non-alignment, which would fail to protect India's national interests and national security. And that is the reason why after Nehru, the subsequent leaders of our nation, they did make changes in this policy. One of them was Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was also realistic in her policies. She did not follow idealism like followed by her father. In fact, her foreign policy initiatives were based on the wisdom of realism. As you all must be very well aware, she made a very pragmatic and a brave decision in 1971 to sign friendship treaty with the USSR. And this friendship treaty was signed despite Western criticism. America and its allies were very critical of India because they used to say, India, you are a hypocrite. You claim to be non-aligned, but you are signing a friendship treaty with USSR. So it was a brave decision which Indira Gandhi made. It was a departure from the non-alignment policy of Nehru, but this was a pragmatic decision. It was a realistic decision because this benefited India. It benefited India's national security. It strengthened India's national security. Because of this friendship treaty, which we had signed with Soviet Union in 1971, we were able to secure Soviet support and neutralize the American threat in the Bay of Bengal during the 1971 war, which we fought with Pakistan. Won that war, extraordinary victory. East Pakistan Army surrendered in front of Indian Army on 16th of December 1971, which is celebrated as the Vijay Divas. And that is how an independent Bangladesh was created. So India contributed significantly in the liberation of Bangladesh. And we were able to defeat Pakistan in the battlefield. And during this war, we were able to secure the Soviet support and neutralize the American threat because of the friendship treaty which we had signed with the USSR. And this was a very pragmatic decision, a realistic decision based on the philosophy of realism, ideology of realism. So Indira Gandhi's foreign policy was driven by wisdom of realism. Whereas Nehru's policy was idealistic in nature, it was too optimistic in nature. And that is why Dr. Jaishankar also criticizes Nehru's policy as optimistic non-alignment. In fact, during the tenure of Nehru, his own home minister, the first home minister of the country, the prominent member of the cabinet, Sardar Patel, had also written letters to Nehru to criticize the policy of non-alignment and had said that we should be more careful with our national security and must consider China as a potential threat and should prepare for a war-like situation with China, which we did not do and suffered in 1962. I would also like to quote students another realist scholar who has criticized Nehru's policy of non-alignment. That is C. Raja Mohan. C. Raja Mohan is a realist scholar. He is a realist scholar on Indian foreign policy, and he regularly writes in the Indian Express newspaper. I'm sure you must have read his articles. So he also criticizes Nehru's policy of non-alignment. He says this policy did not benefit India. Like I told you, India lost territories to both neighbors, Pakistan and China, during the tenure of Nehru. So policy of non-alignment wasn't able to secure India's interests. And also then he is of the opinion that India was never genuinely non-aligned. He says, except the tenure of Nehru, as long as Pandit Nehru was the prime minister, you can claim that India was non-aligned. But apart from that period, he says India was never genuinely non-aligned because India had signed friendship treaty with Soviet Union in 1971. Therefore, India was considered close to the Soviet camp. And Americans also made that argument multiple times. In fact, during the Cold War period, we did not have a good relationship with US for the major part of the Cold War, especially after 1971. We did not have a good relationship with US. In fact, USA used to describe India as a team B of USSR. So he says that India was non-aligned. India was genuinely non-aligned only during the tenure of Pandit Nehru. And subsequent leaders did make changes in the policy. And apart from the tenure of Nehru, we were never genuinely non-aligned, the tenure from 1947 to 1964. And he says that basically Indian policy of non-alignment was synonym with reflexive anti-Americanism of India. He says it reflected anti-Americanism because we used to claim that we are non-aligned, but we had signed a friendship treaty with USSR. Therefore, America used to describe India as Team B of USSR. So non-alignment was more of a reflection of anti-Americanism in India's policy circles. So that is how C. Raja Mohan also gives a critical account. But Henry Kissinger disagrees. I would also like to quote the viewpoint of Henry Kissinger here. Who is Henry Kissinger? He's a former Secretary of State of US, one of the greatest diplomats of US. He was there during the Cold War period. He also agrees. He says, yes, no doubt. He says that policy of non-alignment was very irritating for US. USA was not pleased with this Indian policy of non-alignment because India used to claim that it is a non-aligned country, but at the same time, India had a friendship treaty with Soviet Union. But he says, if you look at it from India's perspective, he says, it was the best possible course of action India could have followed at that particular time period. Even though it was not good for US, it was very irritating for US, but from India's perspective, he says that is the best possible course of action which India could have followed. So Henry Kissinger disagrees with the views of C. Raja Mohan and other critiques of non-alignment. So therefore, students, there are many such scholars and experts who have also criticized Nehru's policy of non-alignment. So we've discussed both now. We've discussed views which have appreciated Nehru's policy of non-alignment, which have highlighted the benefits of this policy, the positive impact of this policy on India's national interest, and we've also discussed critiques of non-alignment. And we were non-aligned during the Cold War period. We did stick to this policy until 1991. But once Cold War ended, end of Cold War created a new sort of a world order. World order changed, international politics changed. So it wasn't possible for India to continue following policy of non-alignment after the end of Cold War. In fact, after the end of Cold War, we saw new orientation in India's foreign policy. Many changes happened in India's foreign policy from 90s onwards. And the trigger for this was end of Cold War. Trigger for this was disintegration of USSR. So there were many reasons because of which we can see a clear change in Indian foreign policy position, clear change in India's policy of non-alignment in the post-Cold War era. And now we must also have a discussion on those reasons. Which were those reasons which prompted India or forced and compelled India to make these foreign policy changes? And a new orientation developed in Indian foreign policy. First of all, students, I must tell you, end of Cold War, disintegration of Soviet Union wasn't happy news for India. It was not a happy piece of news for India. Why? Because who had lost the Cold War? India's friend had lost the Cold War. And who had won the Cold War? Pakistan's friend had won the Cold War. In fact, during the Cold War period, Pakistan was a military alliance partner of US. Pakistan and US fought together in Afghanistan against Soviet Union, in this proxy war against Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Pakistan was a member of alliances like SEATO and CENTO, which were led by US. So India's friend lost the war. Pakistan's friend won the war. India's friend got disintegrated. And this wasn't happy news for India. It was a big challenge for India. How to adapt to this new world order? And now to adapt to this new world order, we started having changes in our foreign policy. Our foreign policy changed. And that is a change which we are discussing today. Transition from non-alignment to multi-alignment. So this transition actually got triggered after the end of Cold War in the post-Cold War era. So let's discuss those changes. So first of all, students, like I mentioned to you, a new world order emerged. Overnight, the world order changed. From a bipolar world, the world transitioned into a unipolar world. A unipolar world where America emerged as the only superpower of the world, as the hegemon of the world. So a period of unipolarity and US hegemony started in the world. US hegemony means dominance. USA started dominating the world. So India had to find ways to adapt to this new world order, to adapt to this new unipolar world, a world of US hegemony. We had to adapt to this. And in order to do this, we were forced to make changes in our foreign policy. Also, students, once Cold War ended, relevance of NAM was also questioned. A lot of experts and leaders around the world, they started questioning the relevance of non-aligned movement and the policy of non-alignment, because the policy of non-alignment and the NAM movement had emerged in the context of Cold War rivalry. Now that Cold War rivalry had ended, now that this rivalry between these two superpowers had ended, now that there were no two rival superpower blocks, so what is the relevance of NAM then? So relevance of NAM, the whole idea of NAM is also being questioned continuously since the end of a Cold War. In fact, that is also a topic in our syllabus, that whether NAM is relevant or not. But that we will discuss some other day in some other video or in the classroom. Right now, we should only focus on the discussion of transition from non-alignment to multi-alignment. So that also happened. And also, students, end of Cold War also meant that capitalism defeated the ideology of communism. End of Cold War was also, a defeat of the communist ideology, because Soviet Union represented the communist ideology. In fact, Francis Fukuyama, the liberal scholar Francis Fukuyama, he describes end of Cold War as end of history. He describes that how liberalism, capitalism was able to triumph over communism. Therefore, after the end of Cold War, students, majority of the countries of the world adopted capitalist policies, adopted liberal policies, LPG policies, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So we do see advent of globalization after the end of Cold War. We do see emergence of a globalized world based on liberal principles after the end of Cold War. Therefore, world order also changed from a world which was described with the help of the billiard balls model given by Arnold Wolfers. From a billiard balls world transitioned into a globalized world, into a cobweb world, cobweb model given by John Burton, where John Burton describes how non-state actors have emerged, how channels of communication between sovereign states have multiplied, how the outer shell of sovereignty has become porous and channels of communication have multiplied. A cobweb world has emerged as a consequence of globalization. A world of complex interdependence have emerged as a consequence of globalization. The idea of complex interdependence given by Robert Keown and Joseph Nye. Both of them are liberal scholars. So world order also changed. From a billiard balls world, a disconnected world, we transitioned into a globalized world, into a cobweb world, into a world of complex interdependence. Economic interdependence emerged between countries. Idea given by Richard Rosecrans. Military states were replaced by trading states. And you will have to quote all these scholarly views and theories in your answers in order to academically enrich your PSIR answers. That is how you make your PSIR answers different from GS answers. You cannot write GS answers in your PSIR paper. So you'll have to make use of these theories, concepts, and scholarly views to write good PSIR answers also. So this also happened, students. The world order also changed. And also 90s is the period when India also needed economic development. India was also suffering from an economic crisis. As you may be aware, India was suffering from a balance of a payment crisis. And in order to overcome this crisis, India also adopted LPG reforms. India also did structural changes in its economic policy. And we also liberalized, privatized, globalized from a closed economy. India transitioned into an open economy. And this also enabled India to develop closeness with the West, develop closeness with the US, because USA was the biggest supporter of such policies. So this change also happened in India's economic policy also. And this change in India's economic policy did resonate with the changing world order, because all over the world we saw emergence of globalization after the end of Cold War, emergence of cobweb world, emergence of a complex interdependent world. And then students, as we enter the 21st century, we saw another change happening in the world order. And that is the rise of China, rise of the emerging powers, which are also described as BRICS countries. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. In fact, now more countries have joined and now it has become BRICS plus. Now it is a set of 11 countries. So the rise of the emerging powers also again triggered a new change in the world order. And out of all these emerging powers, the most prominent has been China. The rise of China. China has grown at such a phenomenal rate in the last 3 decades that it has been one of the fastest growing economies, and now it has become the second largest economy of the world. If it continues at the same pace, very soon it may replace US and become the largest economy. Therefore, China has today become a big geopolitical challenge to US. And China has become the biggest threat to US hegemony today. So that has also happened. That change has also happened. Therefore, we can see that the world order is now again transitioning. During Cold War, it was bipolar, then it turned into unipolar. And now because of rise of China, because of rise of the BRICS countries, because of rise of emerging powers, now the world is becoming a multipolar. Now the world is becoming multipolar. Multiple centers of power are emerging in the world. So all these changes have happened, students, after the end of Cold War. And all these changes did compel India to also change its foreign policy. So therefore, after the end of Cold War, we can see a new orientation in India's foreign policy. So this triggered the change in Indian foreign policy, and that is the reason why, students, we see a major change in the 21st century as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned. We have seen an era of complex multi-alignment emerging. That is the transition which we are discussing. From a policy of non-alignment, now India is transitioning towards a multi-alignment. So because of all these reasons which we just discussed, Indian policy also started changing. India has been a very, very prudent and a wise country. As we enter the 21st century, India realized that another change is happening in world politics now. Now, world order earlier was unipolar, now it is becoming multipolar. So India decided to maintain good relationship with all the multiple power centers which are emerging in the world. And that is very prudent, because in a multipolar world, it would be very good from India's point of view if you are able to maintain all good relations with all major power centers emerging in the world. And that is what India has now started doing. In fact, this is what Dr. Manmohan Singh had initiated, this policy of multi-alignment, and it is being further strengthened by Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi also follows the same policy of multi-alignment. So as we enter the 21st century, an era of complex multi-alignment was initiated. India started developing good relations with all the multiple power centers emerging in the world. And this was also possible because India had done these economic reforms. India had also become one of the fastest growing economies of the world, which India gave considerable confidence that India can secure its own interests, India can exercise strategic autonomy, and also because India had acquired nuclear weapons in 1998. India has become a nuclear weapon state. That has also given India a lot of confidence that India can safeguard its own national security on its own. And therefore, there's no need to depend on any other country. And that is why we could make this brave policy change, this pragmatic policy change, and we are maintaining good relations with all the emerging power centers of the world, which, by the way, has not been easy. For example, India continues to develop good relationship with the US. India continues to develop good relationship with US. And this tilt towards USA had started in the 90s itself. When India did economic reforms, when India opened up its economy, foreign investments started pouring into India. And majority of these foreign investments were basically American investments. So in the 90s itself, India had started tilting towards US, gradually started developing close relations with US. And that tilt is continuing till date. So much so that now India and US have become strategic partners. They've also developed a robust defense partnership. They also have signed a nuclear deal. They're also cooperating with each other as far as civil nuclear technologies are concerned. And also now cooperating in multiple new technologies like critical and emerging technologies, semiconductor technologies. These are all latest developments. In fact, US has also now become the second largest trading partner of India. So the friendship which we have been pursuing with US, the Indian tilt towards US, India's tilt toward the West, which had triggered in the 90s, that is continuing till date. But at the same time, students, we've also developed a very robust friendship with Russia also. India has developed a very robust friendship with Russia as well. With Russia also, India has developed strategic and defense partnership. In fact, recently, President Putin, president of Russia, has awarded Prime Minister Modi with the highest civilian honor of Russia. We are having annual India-Russia summits. So at the same time, we are also developing good ties with Russia. Russia is also an important power center of the world. India is dependent on Russia also for oil supply and defense supply. So we are developing good relations with Russia as well, and both of them are rivals. At the same time, students, India is also maintaining significant economic ties with China also. Who is India's largest trading partner today? It is China. In fact, India has been part of China-led initiatives like BRICS and SCO also. So even though we have rivalry with China, even though we have border dispute with China, even though we have differences with China, but we are also maintaining a significant economic relationship with China. In fact, India and China both agree on globalization. They want to defend globalization. Whereas Western countries, America, there is a backlash against globalization now from the West, because Western countries have realized that these countries like China, emerging economies, BRICS economies, they are the new beneficiaries of globalization. And even US is having a trade deficit with China today. Therefore, we can see that now these Western countries, slowly they are transitioning away from globalization. But emerging economies, they have become the biggest supporters of globalization now. They're also described as semi-periphery states by the neo-Marxist scholar Immanuel Wallerstein. Immanuel Wallerstein has given core periphery model in which he says the rich countries, developed countries are the core states, emerging economies, BRICS economies are semi-periphery states, and the poor countries, the least developed countries are the periphery states. So semi-peripheries, both India and China are semi-peripheries, and they have been trying to defend globalization and WTO. So with China also we have agreements on certain areas, and China and US are also rivals. Then at the same time, students, we've also developed a good relationship with Iran. In fact, there used to be a point when Iran became our biggest oil supplier. And in fact, we are making massive investments in Iran. We're constructing the Chabar seaport in Iran. And at the same time, students, we've also developed good relationship with Israel. In fact, Israel, now we are buying many of our high-tech weapons from Israel. India and Israel has also developed a very good relationship over the years. Our Israel policy has also changed. And at the same time, we are also developing good relations with the Arab states. Arab states also, countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, we have developed a very significant relationship with these countries also. And also with EU, European Union, which is also a major power center of the world, we've developed very good relationship with EU also. So you can see that I've given certain examples here. You can see India is maintaining good relations with all the emerging power centers of the world. This is what we describe as transition towards multi-alignment. Prime Minister Modi says, earlier we used to maintain equal distance from everybody, but now we maintain equal closeness with everyone, with all the multiple power centers emerging in the world. This is described as multi-alignment, policy of multi-alignment. This transition we have seen, and you can see how difficult it is for us to do this. US and Russia are rivals. US and China are rivals. US and Iran are rivals. Also, Iran and Israel are rivals. Iran and Arab states are rivals. European Union and China also has differences. So you can see these are all power centers which have rivalries with respect to each other. They have rivalries with respect to each other, but India is maintaining good friendly relations with all of them. Now imagine you having 5 to 7 friends and they're all rivals of each other. Don't you think it would be very challenging for you to maintain friendship with so many friends which are rivals of each other? You will never be able to meet them together. You can never go on a dinner date together with all your friends. You can only meet one friend at one time, and you can't tell the other guy that I met the other guy yesterday. You'll have to lie to them because they're all rivals of each other. So is it not very challenging to balance friendship between such countries which are rivals of each other? So this is the skill of delicate balancing which India has acquired over the years. How to balance India-US relations and India-Russia relations, India-US relations and India-China relations, India-US and India-Iran relations, India-Iran and India-Israel relations, India-Iran and India-Arab relations. So delicate balancing India has been doing, and it is very challenging for India to do this. And the very fact that we have been able to do this, because we have strategic autonomy, because we have an independent autonomous foreign policy, because we are not a camp follower. That is why we have been able to do this. In fact, I would help you understand how India right now is exercising this policy of multi-alignment by joining all the groupings in the world, US-led initiatives also, China and Russia-led initiatives also. For example, India has joined all US-led initiatives which have been launched to counter the rise of China, which represent America's China containment policy. For example, India has joined Quad. Purpose of Quad is to counter the rise of China. India is also a member of IPF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has been launched by America to counter the economic rise of China in the Indo-Pacific. India is also part of PGI, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. This is also US-led multilateral initiative, which has been launched to counter the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And one of the prominent projects of PGI is IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe Corridor, which also India is implementing with the help of Americans. So these are all US-led initiatives. These are US-led multilateral initiatives which have been launched to counter the rise of China. They represent America's China containment policy. And we are part of all these initiatives. But at the same time, India is also part of China-led and Russia-led initiatives. We are a member of BRICS, which has now become BRICS Plus, an 11-member body. And the purpose of BRICS, everybody knows in the world, the purpose of BRICS is to counter the economic hegemony of US. Because BRICS is led by China, and China is the biggest threat to American hegemony, and especially America's economic hegemony, because China has already become the second largest economy, very soon may replace US and become the largest economy. And in the BRICS countries, they discuss issues like de-dollarization. America certainly doesn't appreciate that. The present President Donald Trump is very, very critical of that. BRICS has also created institutions to counter America-led financial institutions like IMF and World Bank. For example, BRICS has created NDB New Development Bank, which is being seen as an alternative to US-dominated IMF and World Bank. So that has also been, so India is part of this China-led, Russia-led initiative called BRICS also. At the same time, India is a member of SCO also, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is also predominantly led by China and Russia. It's a China-led, Russia-led initiative, SCO. And purpose of SCO has been also to counter American hegemony. India is also part of AIIB, Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, which is again a China-led initiative. The biggest investor in this bank is China. The purpose of this bank is also to create an alternative to US-led IMF and World Bank. The biggest investor in AIIB is China, and the second largest investor is India. And to make matters even more complicated for you, we are part of AIIB, and at the same time, we have boycotted the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But many BRI projects are financed by AIIB. India is the second largest investor in AIIB. That is what is described as complex interdependence, love-hate relationship, as described by Robert Keown and Joseph Nye. So you can see here, what can you see here? India is part of all the teams. India is that player which is playing from all the IPL teams, batting, bowling, fielding from all the teams. The common denominator of whatever I have written on the board is India. India is part of the US-led initiatives, also part of China and Russia-led initiatives. And this is, students, this is what is described as multi-alignment. That is maintaining good relations with all emerging power centers of the world. And that is what Prime Minister Modi says. Earlier he says we used to have equal distance from everybody, but now we have equal closeness with everybody. So this is the transition which has happened from non-alignment, from a period when we used to stay away from all the superpowers and major alliances. Now we are part of all major initiatives in the world which have been launched by US, launched by China, launched by Russia. So India is part of US-led initiatives also, and China-led, Russia-led initiatives as well. And why we have been able to do this? It has been very challenging. No other country is able to follow such a policy. We are able to follow such a policy because we have strategic autonomy. We have an independent, autonomous foreign policy. Our foreign policy is designed to protect India's national interest. And that's the mantra which we follow. And India has not been, no other country has been able to compel or force India to make policy changes. So we have our independent foreign policy, strategic autonomy, and there's a great deal of flexibility in Indian foreign policy. This reflects the strength of the flexibility and the maneuverability of Indian foreign policy. So this is the transition which have taken place. That's the transition which I wanted to, help you understand. From the Nehruvian idea of non-alignment, now we have transitioned to multi-alignment. I must also now discuss scholarly views on this. There has been scholarly views on this which appreciate this change, that this change has benefited India, has helped India secure its own interests. So let's discuss those scholarly views as well. First of all, I would like to discuss the viewpoint of Ian Hall. Ian Hall is of the view that this transition which India has done from non-alignment to multi-alignment, it has enabled India to do economic development. It has been good for Indian economy, that China is the largest trading partner, US is the second largest trading partner, EU is also one of the largest trading partners. So Indian economy has benefited. Like, I would like to quote Dr. Jaishankar recently. Dr. Jaishankar recently says that in the world of multi-alignment, India was able to resist all pressure to condemn Russia in the Ukraine war. And at the same time, India converted Russia into one of our biggest oil suppliers. So the Ukraine crisis led to an oil crisis. Oil prices all over the world had gone up, but India did not suffer because India was able to secure subsidized oil supply from Russia. So we are able to secure our economic interests because of this multi-alignment policy. And at the same time, it has also helped India strengthen its own national security. We know that we cannot ignore our friend Russia, because if we jeopardize our relations with Russia, then there's a possibility that a counter alliance between Russia, China, and Pakistan, this nexus of Russia, China, Pakistan may emerge, which would jeopardize our interests. But at the same time, we also need American help to counter the rise of China, and we are able to do both. And therefore, we are able to strengthen our economic development and national security with the help of the multi-alignment policy, and also at the same time, exercise considerable amount of influence in world politics. And this is what Ian Hall describes as a normative hedging. I would also like to quote M.K. Narayanan. Now, who is M.K. Narayanan? He is the former National Security Advisor of India. And he has also written on the multi-alignment policy. He says, thankfully, we've come out of Cold War trappings. He says, we've left the Cold War trappings behind us. He says that non-alignment policy had outlived its utility. It was not beneficial anymore. So it's good that we have left that policy behind us. And he says it's good that we are now having wider engagement with all world powers, all major power centers emerging in the world. Like I told you, that a multipolar world is emerging. Therefore, India has decided to not put all its eggs into one basket and align with and develop closeness with all the multiple power centers emerging in the world. Also appreciated by Mr. Narayanan, our former National Security Advisor. I would also like to quote Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar. Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar is a big supporter of the policy of multi-alignment, which is also described as multiple engagements or all alignment. In fact, he says that this is the a policy which would best secure India's interests right now in the world. He says it is a more realistic policy. Like I told you, Nehruvian policy was idealistic, but he says, Dr. Jaishankar says, this multi-alignment policy of Prime Minister Modi is more realistic. It does reflect realistic multiple engagements of the future. In fact, Dr. Jaishankar says that India has changed. India has become one of the major global powers of the world. And today, world has expectations from India. India cannot be reluctant and defensive anymore. India should take important stands on world issues, on global challenges, strong positions. And that's what he says has happened. He says since Prime Minister Modi has come into power, Indian diplomacy has become more energetic. And under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we've been trying to project India as a global powerhouse. And that is why he appreciates the policy of multi-alignment. He says it's a very realistic policy. And he says that this policy enables India to do strategic hedging. This policy enables India to exercise the concept of strategic hedging. He says hedging is the name of the game today, Dr. Jaishankar. He says India, through the policy of multi-alignment, is doing strategic hedging. What is strategic hedging, students? Even Ian Hall has hinted towards this. So what is strategic hedging? Hedging is an idea used in the field of economics. Investment bankers, they use this idea. We have borrowed this from the field of economics and we brought it into IR and have developed this concept called strategic hedging. You know what happens in investment banking, in economics? People who invest money, they obviously want that their money should multiply, their money should grow, and they want to minimize the risk of loss. So how do they minimize the risk of loss? By hedging against the losses. So when they make investments in diverse asset classes. If you invest, for example, all your money in stock markets, you are taking a very high risk. It's a high risk investment. There's a high risk that you may lose your money. Why? Because stock markets are very volatile. But if you diversify your investments, for example, some money you put in stock market, some money in crypto markets, some money in FD account, some money in gold, some money in real estate. So if you will make diverse investments, the possibility of the risk of loss decreases. And that's called hedging. That's called hedging against losses. And that's exactly what we are doing in IR today. In IR, India is right now practicing the policy of a strategic hedging. Can you confidently answer this question that after 20 years from now, which would be the dominant country in the world? Which country will dominate the world 20 years from now? Nobody can answer that question right now because the world is in a state of transition. From a unipolar world, we are transitioning towards a multipolar world. So we cannot confidently answer the question that who would dominate the world 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So therefore, in such a changing world scenario, it would not be wise to put all your eggs into one basket. It would not be wise to over-rely only on one particular country. Therefore, instead of putting all eggs into one basket, India is diversifying its relationships. India is doing strategic hedging. India is maintaining good relations with all the power centers of the world which are emerging. All emerging power centers of the world. This strategy is described as strategic hedging. This will best secure India's national interest, and this is best suited to the changing world order, best suited to the emerging multipolar world. And that is what India is able to do by following the policy of multi-alignment. That is what Dr. Jaishankar also has written. He says, hedging is the name of the game today. So all these scholars and policy practitioners, they have appreciated India's transition from non-alignment to multi-alignment. And we have been undergoing this transition. However, students, recently, this transition has hit a wall. This transition has hit a roadblock. And this happened in the year 2022. It is not easy to undergo this transition. It is not easy to exercise multi-alignment policy. And this big challenge emerged in the year 2022 in the form of the Ukraine war. In the year 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. In fact, February 2025, when I am recording this particular video, it is the 3rd anniversary of the Ukraine war. So since last 3 years, from 2022 onwards, Ukraine war has been going on. And this Ukraine war, this Ukraine crisis has made it difficult for India to balance friendship with US and Russia. And also, balance relations with both these. India has friendly relations with both of them. But how to balance this relationship, how to balance this friendship in the context of the ongoing Ukraine war, it has become difficult for India. So this challenge we are facing right now. In fact, Ukraine war is a reflection of what? It's a reflection of great power rivalries emerging again, because Russia is a successor of USSR. It is a reflection of an emerging polarized world again. It is a reflection of emerging new Cold War-like scenario. In fact, a lot of experts, which would include John Mearsheimer, offensive neo-realist, which would include Rajesh Rajagopalan, the realist scholar of India, they're of the opinion that a new Cold War has started. A new Cold War has emerged. And this time, the new Cold War is happening between US. This time, the new Cold War rivals is US and China. US and China are right now engaged in a new Cold War-like situation. And the center of world politics has now shifted. The center of gravity of world politics during the Cold War period used to be Atlantic, transatlantic region. Now the center of world politics have shifted towards Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific has become the new geopolitical theater for the tussle between the Americans and the Chinese. So a new Cold War-like situation has emerged. In fact, this Ukraine war is an example of more of a proxy war. Because Ukraine is being backed by America and NATO members, and Russia is being strongly backed by China. So you can say Russia sponsored by China, backed by China, and Ukraine backed by the Americans and NATO members are fighting a war against each other. So this is more of a proxy war which is going on since last 3 years. And it's a reflection of great power rivalries emerging again. It's a reflection of the world again becoming polarized. It's a reflection of emergence of new Cold War situation between US and China. So in the context of this changing world order, in the context of the emerging new Cold War, maintaining the policy of multi-alignment, exercising multi-alignment has become difficult for India. It has become difficult for India to balance India-Russia relationship, and balance India-US relationship. It's difficult to balance India-Russia and India-US friendship. It's difficult to manage our simultaneous membership of Quad and also BRICS and SCO. That is why India is doing a diplomatic tightrope. India has been, very carefully taking diplomatic stances on the Ukraine war. As you know, India has refused to condemn Russia. India has refrained from condemning Russia, but India has condemned the war. Prime Minister Modi has told President Putin that this is not the era of war. War must end. But we haven't blamed Russia for the war. And India has taken a stance that whatever dispute the Russians and the Ukrainians have, that should be resolved peacefully with the help of peaceful dialogue. But we haven't condemned Russia for the war. In fact, Americans and Western countries, they did propose many resolutions against Russia in international organizations like UN Security Council also. And India has abstained in all these resolutions. India has not voted against Russia. So India has condemned the war, but haven't condemned Russia. So we are trying to do a diplomatic tightrope. And I would like to quote Chinmay Garekhan in this particular context. Who is Chinmay Garekhan? He's the former IFS officer of India. He's the longest serving India's representative to United Nations. And he says that India's stand in the Ukraine war is actually very similar to the Nehruvian policy of non-alignment. He says that actually it's very similar to the Nehruvian policy of non-alignment because we haven't condemned the Russians, and at the same time we have condemned the war also, and we have sympathized with the killings of innocent civilians in Ukraine. India has condemned those killings. India has condemned Bucha killings. India wants that the war must end. India also tries to maintain, certain amount of synergy with the Western countries and their criticism of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But we haven't condemned Russia at the same time. We haven't voted against Russia in international organizations like United Nations. So this, he says, this stand which India has taken, a very middle path kind of a stand in the Ukraine crisis, this diplomatic tightrope which we are doing, it's actually very similar to the Nehruvian policy of non-alignment, Chinmay Garekhan says, which compels us to think that, NAM may have lost its relevance, students. Non-aligned movement may have lost its relevance. And that's actually quite evident from the fact that Prime Minister Modi has become the first full-term Prime Minister of India to not attend any NAM summit. So you can see India is not interested in this particular movement anymore. It must have lost, it has lost its relevance. But non-alignment as a policy choice, non-alignment as a policy choice has not lost its relevance. It is still relevant today. You have to draw a distinction between non-alignment as a policy and non-aligned movement. Non-aligned movement may not be very relevant in a post-Cold War world, but non-alignment as a policy choice, that means exercising strategic autonomy, having independent foreign policy, best securing India's national interests. That is what, as a policy choice, it is still relevant. And you can see that in the Ukraine crisis, the kind of stand which India has taken, according to Mr. Garekhan, it's actually very similar to the Nehruvian policy. So even though we have transitioned from non-alignment to multi-alignment, and we are having challenges doing this transition, especially in the context of the Ukraine crisis, but you can draw a lot of similarities between the non-alignment policy and the multi-alignment policy, because both non-alignment policy and multi-alignment policy has the same goal. And what is that goal? The goal of maintaining strategic autonomy, exercising strategic autonomy. So this is the transition which has happened, students, from non-alignment to multi-alignment. I've tried my best to discuss all relevant aspects of this particular theme in this video. And also we've discussed views of all the scholars. I hope you have all benefited from this particular lecture. And I do, hope to see you all in the classroom so that we can have many more such fruitful discussions on Indian foreign policy and international politics. Thank you so much, students. It was a pleasure interacting with all of you. Thank you so much.